In a scrivener's room in Lagash, a man turns a cut reed in his fingers and presses it 4 times into damp clay. Su. The sign group we read today as the Anunnaki of Sumer, who were never one god, but a body of gods, acting and judging and deciding together. The tablet lies in his left palm, still cool, still soft enough to take a fingerprint. And here is the puzzle that will keep us company through the long hours ahead. What were the Anunnaki, the collective, the oldest written religion, placed at the very center of fate, yet who left behind no temple of their own, no portrait as a group, no agreed number, and not even a complete list of their names? If these old myths help you rest, subscribe so another god or hero can find you at bedtime. We have a great deal of quiet ground to cross. There is a sea that existed before anything else, and the moment heaven and earth were pulled apart by force. There is a strike, lesser gods setting fire to their tools and standing at night outside the house of their master. There is a hall below the world where 7 judges take their seats on golden thrones, with coral laid along the threshold steps. And there is the long, stubborn, modern quarrel over what these tablets actually say, and what certain men in the last century insisted they said instead. Let the room go dark around you. None of this requires your effort. Return to the reed and the clay. The stylus is trimmed to a 3-sided tip, so every impression it leaves is a small wedge, deeper at the head and tapering to nothing. A shape you make by pressing, never by dragging. The scribe works in the shadow of a lamp, and the surface of the tablet takes the light unevenly, so the wedges read as tiny troughs of shadow. He is not composing. He is copying the formula his ruler requires, and the ruler is Gudea, who governed the city-state of Lagash somewhere around the years between roughly 2144 and 2124 before our era, when the Akkadian Empire had already fallen away and native Sumerian speech was reasserting itself in the south. Inscriptions from that reign are, as far as anyone has yet found, among the very earliest places where the word appears at all, together with texts from the 3rd dynasty of Ur, the century of Sumerian revival that followed, which tells you something slightly disorienting at the outset. Writing in Sumer is older than these gods' collective name by a very long stretch. Wedge marks were being pressed into clay in the cities of the plain for centuries before anyone recorded the Anunnaki as a body. The name arrives late in the written record of a civilization that was already ancient when it wrote it down. So the scribe in Lagash is not preserving a fresh idea. He is inscribing a phrase that had been spoken, most likely, for generations before the clay caught it, and the clay is the only reason we have it at all. Papyrus rots. Leather rots. Clay, baked accidentally in the fire of a burning building or simply buried dry under a collapsed wall, keeps every wedge exactly as the reed left it. A tablet like the one in his hand can sit in the dark for 4,000 years and come out legible. The whole of this subject, every argument and every uncertainty in it, rests on that one dull mercy of the material. Take the name apart slowly, because its shape, carries most of the argument. In Sumerian, the group is written in forms transcribed by scholars as Da Nun Na, and, with the plural and genitive elements attached, Da Nun Na Ke for Ne. The leading sign is not part of the pronounced word at all. It is a marker placed before divine names, a silent instruction to the reader that what follows belongs to the gods. What remains is a compact little phrase built of ordinary Sumerian material. Its meaning is offered in the scholarly literature in several closely related forms: princely offspring, royal offspring, or more literally, the offspring, the progeny, the seed of princes. None of these is certain, and the sources present them as possibilities rather than as a settled translation. But every version of it points the same direction. Whoever these beings are, they are defined by descent, not by a domain, not by a craft, not by a mountain or a river or a season, by whose children they are. The sound of it changed as it traveled. The Sumerian form was likely pronounced something close to Anunnaki, a soft, unhurried word, ending without emphasis. When Akkadian speakers took it over, and Akkadian was a Semitic language quite unrelated to Sumerian in its bones, it entered their vocabulary as a loanword. Anunnaki Ku Ka. And here the small irony arrives, the kind of irony only grammar can produce. The form that the whole modern world now uses, Anunnaki, with that final long vowel, is the genitive inflection of that Akkadian noun. It is the of the form, which means that treating it as a proper name, a fixed title for a fixed group, is essentially faulty as grammar. We have spent a century and a half putting a case ending on posters. You will also find the word spelled a dozen different ways in books and articles. Anunnaki with one N, Anunnaki with three, Anunna without the ending at all, Anunnaki. These are not different beings. They are different scholars in different decades, reaching for Latin letters that were never designed to hold this language. And there is one trap in the name that catches almost everyone who meets it for the first time. The word begins with Nan. The Sumerian god of the sky is called An. The eye slides from one to the other and makes a bridge. Anunnaki, the people of An, the sky lineage, the heaven folk. It is a satisfying bridge, and it is not there. The sources are explicit. No etymological relation exists between the name Anunnaki and the name of the sky deity An. The resemblance is a coincidence of syllables, nothing more, which is stranger than it sounds, because the Anunnaki were believed to be the children of An. The connection the name seems to make is a connection the mythology genuinely asserts. The etymology just isn't the reason for it. Two true things sitting side by side, and no thread running between them. Their parentage, then. An, god of the heavens, and Ki, the goddess who is the earth. From that union came the Anunnaki, and the family arrangement is as plain as any in the ancient world: sky above, earth beneath, and everything born of the two of them belonging in some measure to both. Samuel Noah Kramer, the American Sumerologist, took the further step of identifying Ki with Ninhursag, the great mother goddess of the Sumerian pantheon, arguing that the two were originally one figure who later separated into two names. That is his position, and it deserves to be given as his rather than as settled fact. The sources report it as a scholar's identification, not as a consensus of the field. The oldest of these children was Enlil, god of the air, chief god of the Sumerian pantheon, and the figure around whom a great deal of what follows will turn. He is the eldest of the Anunnaki in the strict sense, firstborn, senior in the assembly, the one whose voice carries. In the earliest texts, the word doesn't describe a shadowy background chorus. It is applied to the most powerful and important deities Sumer had, the descendants of the sky god An, the top of the pantheon rather than its lower ranks. The group probably included what the tradition calls the seven gods who decree, An himself, Enlil, Enki the god of wisdom and sweet water, Ninhursag, Nana the moon, Utu the sun, and Inanna. Say those names slowly, and you have very nearly the whole spine of Sumerian religion in a single breath. And their office, their function in the earliest writings about them, was to decree the fates of humanity, not to make the world, not to guard a gate, to decide, to sit as a body and settle what would happen to the people living on the plain below and to the cities those people had built. You can watch them doing it in the Sumerian poem known as Enki and the World Order. In that composition, the Anunnaki come before Enki and do homage to him. They sing hymns of praise in his honor, and they take up their dwellings among the people of Sumer. They move in other words, and live in the cities alongside the farmers and the fishermen and the potters. Twice in the same poem, the text says plainly that the Anunnaki decree the fates of mankind. Twice, in one composition, as if the poet wanted the phrase fixed in the listener's ear. That is nearly the whole job description we have. It is also, in a sense, the largest job description imaginable. Now hold that against what is missing, because the silence around them is the most peculiar thing about them. They are, overwhelmingly, a literary phenomenon. Hymns, epics, poems, and a small handful of royal inscriptions, the ones from Gudea's reign, the ones from the third dynasty of Ur. That is where they live. Very little evidence supporting the existence of any cult of them as a group has yet been unearthed. No processions of the Anunnaki, no priesthood of the Anunnaki, no barge kept inside a temple to carry their statues along the canal at festival time, as the great individual gods had. The likely explanation offered for that absence is beautifully simple, and once you hear it, it stops being a mystery and becomes a piece of ordinary sense. Each member of the Anunnaki already had a cult of their own: Enlil at Nippur, Enki at Eridu, Inanna at Uruk, each with a house, a statue, a set of priests, a daily meal laid out before them. Every one of the committee was already being fed. There was no reason to worship the committee. No representation of them as a complete group has ever been discovered either. A few images have been identified showing 2 or 3 individual members together, a pairing, a small conference in stone, but nothing that could be called a group portrait. Whatever picture forms in your mind when you hear the word, no ancient artist appears to have drawn it, nor has any complete list of their names survived. Not a damaged one, not a partial one that scholars can confidently extend, and the texts that do count them cannot agree with each other. In one great myth of the underworld, there are exactly 7 of them. In the ritual texts of the Hurrians and Hittites, far to the north and much later, the old gods identified with them are always 8, though the names in the list keep changing. One text associates as many as 50 Anunnaki with the city of Eridu. A late Babylonian version of the creation epic counts 300 of them in heaven and 600 below the earth. 7, 8, 50, 300, 600. And, on the question of what they actually do, the sources are just as inconsistent. There is no single divine function the texts will all sign. If that feels like a failure of evidence, try turning it the other way round. What survives is not a roster, it is a habit of mind. The conviction that the highest decisions are never made by one voice. The major deities of the Mesopotamian pantheon were believed to take part in the assembly of the gods, and it was through that assembly that the gods made all of their decisions. Everything of consequence went to the floor, and scholars have long noticed what that assembly resembles. It looks like a divine counterpart to the semi-democratic legislative arrangement that existed on Earth during the 3rd dynasty of in the century around 2100 to 2000 before our era, the very period from which our earliest uses of the name come. Which means the Anunnaki are, among other things, a portrait of how Sumerians thought power ought to work. Elders in a room, cases heard, a decision taken by the body rather than the man. The gods governed the way the Sumerians governed, and the Sumerians governed the way they believed the gods did, and neither end of that circle can be shown to have come first. But before there was any assembly to sit in, before there was a floor to stand on, or a sky to sit under, the sources say there was only water. Water first, and nothing at all to break it. No shore, no floor, no light on the surface, because there is no surface, only sea, going on in every direction, with nothing to be a direction from. The Sumerian scribes gave that water a name. They called her Nammu, the primeval sea, and in the oldest account of how things came to be, she is not the first of several. She is the only one. Nothing stands beside her to be described, nothing above her to look down. There is no battle at the opening of this cosmogony, no adversary, no wound. There is deep water and a mother in it. What survives of that account is very short. It comes to us in the prologue to a longer poem. Gilgamesh, Enkidu, and the Netherworld. Catalogued in the modern electronic corpus of Sumerian literature as Text 1.8.1.4, and the poem's real business lies further on, elsewhere, with other matters entirely. Creation is handled first, quickly, the way a scribe might clear his throat. A few lines set the sea, the sky, the earth. Then the poem moves on to what it actually came to say. That brevity is the honest shape of the evidence, and it deserves saying plainly, with the single exception of the Babylonian. Enuma Elish. No surviving Mesopotamian text sits down and systematically explains how the cosmos was arranged. There is no Sumerian volume of first principles waiting in a museum drawer. What modern scholars have is a roughly accurate reconstruction, assembled out of scattered Sumerian and Akkadian cuneiform, out of allusions inside poems written for other purposes, and out of comparison with the Hebrew Bible, where some of the same old furniture keeps appearing in new rooms. So when the sequence is laid out cleanly, this, then this, then this, remember that the cleanliness belongs to the scholarship. The tablets themselves are more like overheard fragments of a conversation whose participants assumed everyone already knew the outline. Still, the outline they assumed is recoverable, and it begins in that shoreless water. From Nammu came An, the sky, and Ki, the earth. Not built, not fashioned out of some material she had at hand. Born. The sea gave birth to the two halves of everything, and those two halves were, at that moment, not halves at all. They were one thing, and then Ki came out of the water pressed together, sky lying on earth without a finger's width between them. And that is the condition the tablets ask you to hold in mind. A world that exists and has no inside. Try to feel the strangeness of it for a moment, there in the dark, with the weight of a blanket over you. Not emptiness, the opposite of emptiness. A solid mass of world with no gap anywhere in it, no room for weather, no room for a bird, no room for a house or a field or a person standing upright. Everything that would later be described as space simply had nowhere to be. An and Ki mated with one another, and Ki gave birth to Enlil. He is the oldest of the Anunnaki, god of the air, and his first act is the act that everything else in Sumer depends upon. He separated An from Ki. He put himself between sky and earth and pushed them apart, and the split held. Heaven went up, earth stayed down, and what opened between them was not a thing so much as a permission, a height, a distance, a place where wind could exist, which is to say, a place where Enlil himself could exist, since air and the god of air arrive in the same instant. Then the division of property, described as calmly as a settlement between brothers. Enlil carried off the earth as his domain. An carried off the sky. The word the poets use is a carrying, as though each took his portion up in his arms and walked away with it, and the cosmos was thereafter two estates instead of one lump. This is Enlil's central cosmological act, and it is worded so briefly that it is easy to pass over. But every later story requires it. The gap he made is where the rivers run and the reeds stand and the grain is planted. It is where a canal can be dug. It is where mortals will eventually be set down and given something to do. Before the separation, there was no room in the world for a human being. Afterward there was, and what would fill that room became, in time, the great question the gods argued over. The house had been opened, the furnishing came next, and the furnishing came the same way the world had, by generation. Enlil married his mother, Ki, and from that union came all the plant and animal life of the earth. Barley and tamarisk, the fish in the marsh channels, the sheep and the goats, and the wild things beyond the canal line. In the Sumerian telling, none of these are manufactured. They are descended. They are the children of the wind and the ground, which is a way of saying that a Sumerian farmer, walking his field at dusk, was walking among his own distant relatives. Ki herself is a slightly unstable figure in the record. That is Kramer's position rather than a settled agreement, and it is the sort of judgment that can be argued either way. But it gives a sense of how these earliest figures behave in the sources. They shade into one another. A name is sometimes a name, and sometimes a face that another name is also wearing. Alongside this strand runs another, stranger and more human, and it concerns Enlil and the goddess Ninlil, the myth of Enlil and Ninlil is a story of pursuit and disguise. Enlil desires her, and he does not approach her once but repeatedly, and each time he comes to her in a different guise, wearing another shape, another office, another borrowed identity. The god of air, who is by nature the thing you cannot see, moves through the story as a series of appearances that are not quite him. It is a myth about a presence you can feel and never catch, a stirring at the back of the neck that has a name and a will behind it. From those encounters, children are conceived. The first is Nanna, the moon god, the pale disk that would be carried, in later centuries, at the center of great cults in the cities of the south. And then, from the same sequence of disguises, three more, Nergal, Ninazu, and Enbilulu, deities of the underworld. Sit with the shape of that for a moment, because it is quietly remarkable. The lineage of the world below is conceived inside a story about wind and pursuit. Up here, on the open earth, nobody descends, nobody is banished. The gods of the lower realm are simply born in the same passage as the moon, from the same father, in the course of the same courtship, and only afterward do they belong to the dark. The underworld, in the oldest telling, is not a punishment invented later and populated by exiles. It is a place with a family already in it, established early, long before anyone thought to reassign the great gods downward. Centuries pass. The tablets keep being copied, and the copying happens in new cities, under new kings, for new patrons, and a story told for a different god comes out differently. Around the 12th century before the Common Era, in Babylon, the Enuma Elish gives the making of the cosmos an entirely different architecture. There is no quiet birth from a shoreless sea here, and no separation performed with the bare pressure of air. In the Babylonian poem, the god Marduk kills Tiamat, the mother of the gods, and from the two halves of her carcass he constructs the heavens. The sky, in that account, is not a domain carried off by an elder brother. It is built material. It has an underside. Someone made it out of something that used to be alive. The two accounts deserve to stand separately, because the temptation to read them as variants of a single story works against what the sources actually say. The Sumerian sequence, sea, sky, and earth, the fused mass, the separating God, is much the older. The Babylonian creation epic comes long afterward, composed for the national god of a city that had risen to dominance in the meantime, and it does the work such poems do. It puts its own patron at the hinge of everything. This is not one variant standing beside another of equal age, two neighboring dialects of a single idea. It is a later architecture raised over an older foundation and not much concerned with matching it. You can watch the same drift happen to numbers, which is where these later versions become genuinely useful for seeing how the tradition moved. A late Babylonian version of that same creation epic counts the Anunnaki out at 300 of heaven and 600 of the underworld, 900 in all, sorted into two great halves like a ledger balanced across the two levels of the cosmos. It is a tidy figure and a satisfying one. It also has no support whatsoever in any earlier text. Nothing from Sumer offers those totals. Other sources give 7. One text attaches 50 of them to the city of Eridu. The numbers wander from poem to poem and never settle. The 300 and the 600 are a late arrangement imposed once someone wanted the divine population to be countable and symmetrical, and to read them backward into the older material is to hear a Babylonian bookkeeper and mistake him for a Sumerian priest, which returns us, in the end, to the poverty and the honesty of that first short prologue. 4 or 5 lines, tucked in front of a poem about something else, are the main thing we have for how the Sumerians thought the world began. A sea, a birth, a fused mass, a god of air who pushed. Everything grander that came later, the slain mother and the constructed heavens and the neatly halved multitudes, is building on ground that was itself never fully written down, and the ground holds anyway. Sky above, earth below, and between them the gap that Enlil opened and then stood in. That arrangement outlasted every kingdom that revised it. Long after the last scribe had set down his stylus, the two estates were still where he had left them. The sky carried off in one direction, the earth in the other, and the wind moving in the space between, patient, unhurried, entirely unconcerned with whose name was written on the tablet. There is a line of clay tablets, copied and recopied across centuries, that opens with a sentence no one has ever quite managed to improve upon: when the gods had to work like humans. In Akkadian, Enuma Ilu Awilum. It is the first line of the epic we call Atrahasis, an 18th century BC composition preserved in several versions, none of them complete, all of them talking to each other across the breaks. The poem is named for one of its protagonists, a priest whose name means exceedingly wise, and the story he belongs to has its roots further back still, in Sumerian historiography, in the way the older scribes had already learned to write about the past. What that opening line quietly tells you is that this is not a story about how the world was made. The world is already there. The earth is finished. The creatures that walk on it are finished. The rivers already run where rivers run. Nothing needs to be spoken into being. What needs to be done is the work. And at the start of this poem, there is nobody to do it but gods. They are organized. That is the striking thing. The epic describes at least 3 parties of gods, bound in an alliance. And they seem to specialize the way any long-standing alliance specializes, into those who think and those who labor. The party gathered around Anu belongs more to the upper heaven, to the high air, where decisions are taken and little dust settles. The party around Enki belongs to the sphere below the earth, to the sweet water under the soil, to the level where things are dug and moved and made to flow. And between them stands Enlil, whose name is often rendered Lord Wind, the one who separated air from earth in the midst of the cosmic ocean, the greatest warrior of the alliance and its chief strategist, presiding over the council. You can hear a very old political arrangement inside that description. Not a throne with a single figure on it, but a coalition, factions with territories, a leader whose authority rests on being the best at the thing the coalition needs most. And an alliance of that kind needs an instrument, something that holds the parties to each other when the work becomes unpleasant. That instrument is the Tablet of Destinies, and Enlil alone possesses it. In the Sumerian myths, it was bestowed on him by the Earth Mother Goddess Ninhursag herself, placed into his keeping, not seized. Whoever holds it holds something more absolute than command. Only Enlil has the ability to transform present circumstances back into their original state, to take what has already happened and set it back to the condition it came from, to redefine the course of fate. Everyone in that council is aware of this. It shapes every conversation they have. The tablet is a legal document, and Mesopotamian legal documents were sealed. The seal was a sign applied mechanically, by a particular technique, rolled or pressed into damp clay. And in this world, that mark meant contract, not decoration, not signature in our sense. Contract. And contract in Mesopotamia meant tribute, shares of the food produced, most often, but more generally, the promise of assistance, help in battle or help in labor. Labor of exactly the kind this epic describes, the construction of mighty irrigation channels. So the alliance is bound by a sealed agreement that specifies who digs. There is one further office, and it sits outside all of this. The 3 parties are parties of male gods, and so the whole enormous business of reproduction is handled elsewhere, by a body of its own, the 7 divine wombs, the Shasaratu, presided over by Ninhursag, who is also called Mummy. 7 of them, held together as a working group, the way the digging gods are held together as a working group. Keep that office in mind. It is quiet at the start of the poem, and it becomes the hinge of everything. The work itself is described with an accuracy that anyone who has lived beside a canal would recognize. The lower gods have the task of ensuring the supply of the land, constructing the irrigation canals, digging out the beds of the big rivers, not tidying a garden, excavating watercourses, shifting the earth of a floodplain, cutting channels deep enough that water will consent to travel along them. And here is the detail that gives the epic its strange, dry humor. The Akkadian paradise, as this poem describes it, is a garden. And in that garden, lower-rank deities are put to work digging a watercourse for the more senior deities, while those seniors watch over the implementation of the plan from above and divide the fruits of the great civilizing project as they see fit. Paradise, in this telling, is a place with a labor roster. Time passes. How much time is one of those small, honest fractures in the material, and there is no reason to paper over it. One account says the lesser gods rebelled after 40 years of strenuous labor. Another gives the number as 40 days. Both figures are in circulation, attached to the same episode. 40 is the number that survived. The unit did not. If you like, hold both in your mind at once. 40 seasons of mud, or 40 exhausting sunrises, because the poem's tablets, in the state they have reached us, do not settle it. What is not in doubt is what happened at the end of that stretch of time. They refuse. They will not carry the baskets any further, will not lift the mattock again at dawn. And then they do something that removes the possibility of a quiet return to work. They set fire to their tools. Wooden handles in a treeless plain where wood is imported and precious. The implements that made them useful and made them subordinate, burning in a heap in a garden that was supposed to be paradise. Then, at night, they go to Enlil's dwelling and surround it. Not a battle, a crowd standing in the dark around a great house, which is a more unsettling thing than an assault, because a crowd that is standing still can wait as long as it likes. Enlil is surprised. The text says so plainly, and the plainness is worth hearing. The greatest strategist of the alliance did not see this coming. He calls for Anu and for Enki, the heads of the other two parties, summoned in the middle of the night to a house with a ring of silent laborers around it, and he sends out his son Nusku, who serves as his ambassador in this scene, to speak with the rebellious party and find terms. Nusku fails. He comes back with nothing but the reason. The toil on the irrigation channel is the cause of the disquiet. That is the whole grievance, and it is not negotiable, because the work has not stopped needing to be done, which leaves the council with a problem that has only one interesting shape. The labor must continue, and none of these gods will do it. Who solved it depends on which tablet you are reading, and the difference matters more than it first appears. One account has the Anunnaki Council deciding together, in assembly, on hearing the reason for the disquiet. They will create man to carry out the agricultural labor. Another account gives the idea to Enlil personally, and in that version he is characterized as the benevolent, wise leader of all the gods, a figure who does not want a battle at all, because a battle between gods carries the risk of serious injury and death among them. He devises the plan to avoid bloodshed, obedient workers easily controlled to take up the mattock the Igigi have burned. Whichever way the idea arrived, the next step is the same, and it is a request rather than a command. He asks Mummy, leader of the 7 wombs, whether she can help. Reproduction is not in his portfolio. It never was. Mami's answer is precise. She can fulfill the request, but only with Enki's assistance. The office of the wombs and the Lord of the sweet water beneath the earth must work together, or there is no making anything at all. Enki agrees, and his first instruction has nothing to do with craft. He advises the assembly of all the gods that before anything else they should cleanse themselves. So they do. Before the making, a washing, the whole council purified, the way you would prepare for a rite rather than for manufacture. On the 15th day of this project, the work proper begins, and it begins with a death. Enki cuts up Geshtu-A, whose name means ear, a party of lesser gods who listen to the wisdom of the higher gods, the faculty of hearing and understanding given divine form. He cuts them into pieces, and to the sound of drums, he begins to make the first human being. Let the drums stay with you a moment, because they are the detail that turns the scene from workshop into ceremony. Not silence, not the tap of a tool, a rhythm kept while the mixture is prepared. The clay comes from the soil of the steppe. Mummy was regarded as primordial Mother Earth, so the clay is not neutral material. It carries her substance already. In Atrahasis, Enki works with Belet Ili, and what they work with is clay and divine blood, the earth of the plain and the life of a god who was taken apart, pressed together, and given a shape that can carry a basket. The variants here are worth keeping distinct rather than blending. In the poem called Enki and Ninma, it is Enki who conceives the plan to fashion the new being that will take over the labor of the gods. In the later Babylonian epic of creation, the making of man is explained instead as a collaboration between Ea and his son Marduk. And Mesopotamian tradition at large, across the centuries, kept a simpler memory of it. Enki as the maker of mankind from clay. 4 tellings, 1 act, and no scribe anywhere seems to have felt the need to reconcile them. What they all agree on is the purpose. With the help of the divine women, the victorious party arranges the production of a first pair of humans who, together with every one of their descendants, are to serve the gods as laborers for eternity, not as companions, not as worshippers first of all, as a workforce with the terms written into their existence. If you are drifting a little now, that is entirely as it should be. The story keeps its own pace and will still be here. The arrangement works, and then it works too well. The pair multiply. Their descendants multiply. Within a few millennia, the poem is content to move at that scale. The unrestrained increase of humanity becomes a crisis, and the crisis lands on the gods who commissioned them. The upper gods try to get it under control in various ways, one after another, each measure a little heavier than the last. And at the end of that sequence comes the flood, a global deluge sent to wipe out the imperfect artificial creatures that the council had made to save itself trouble. In the Babylonian version, the reason given for it is almost domestic in its smallness. Enlil sends the flood because the noise of humanity keeps him from sleeping. The tablets of Atrahasis preserve this connection in comparatively good condition, which means it is not a reconstruction or a guess. The link between the racket of a crowded earth and the decision to drown it is right there in the clay. The god who had wanted no bloodshed among gods orders the extinction of a species because he cannot rest. He does not get it. One fertile human couple survives through an act of sabotage by one of the lower gods and through the advice Enki gives to his human protege, the wise priest whose name the whole epic carries. Enki, once again, the one who finds the way around a decision that has already been taken. And then something quietly remarkable happens, which is that the quarreling rulers of Mesopotamia sit down and negotiate. Having failed to destroy the population, they agree instead on a method of holding human reproduction at a tolerable level. The crisis is settled by administration rather than by water. The alliance that began by sealing a labor contract ends by drafting a population policy. Set beside all of this, the Sumerian flood story, known as Eridu Genesis, and the picture will not resolve. That poem recounts the dawn of civilization, how the gods brought their various inventions down from a sacred mountain to the earth, and it even hints that groups of prehistoric people had roamed Mesopotamia before that as free nomads. It resembles Atrahasis in several central respects, but at its end, Enlil rewards Ziusudra, the survivor of the flood, with immortality, a gift given face to face for having come through. The same god. In one set of tablets, the sender of a flood meant to erase humanity for the crime of being audible. In another, the giver of endless life to the one man who outlasted the water. And in the Atrahasis material itself, the benevolent and wise leader who devised the making of humankind precisely to avoid harm. That contradiction is not a puzzle awaiting a solution. It is what the tradition looks like from the inside. A god large enough to hold both, worshipped by cities that also knew what a bad flood year did to them. Modern readers have come to this epic with their own instruments, and a few of their readings are worth laying alongside the ancient text, as long as we are clear about which is which. Recent research suggests that the relatively rapid rise in sea levels at the end of the last ice age may have formed the actual backdrop to the Atrahasis narrative. Not the myth's meaning, but the world in which its memory formed. J. Rose is quoted to the effect that such an event is likely to have made an impression on the emerging settled communities, particularly given that the population living in the affected areas had become fully literate within 3 millennia of the last flood. Water arriving over generations, coastlines moving, and then, soon enough, in the long measure, people able to write about it. A second reading concerns the alliance rather than the flood. The archaeologist and prehistorian Klaus Schmidt, among others, worked on the founding of Mesopotamian civilization by ancient nomadic communities. On his interdisciplinary view, cultivating large agricultural areas and raising monumental structures such as those at Göbekli Tepe could hardly have been accomplished by single groups of hunter-gatherers. It presupposes the formation of the first cross-group organizations, small communities that had previously lived self-sufficiently and in competition, deciding to settle their conflicts in order to cooperate in a shared territory. And the alliance of the three god parties in Atrahasis on this argument describes that achievement quite well. The negotiated coalition, the divided specialisms, the sealed contract about who provides what. The dating attached to that reading needs handling with care. A founding figure of 9,700 years before the present has been proposed for such a cross-group organization, arrived at through an assumed association with Göbekli Tepe. That is an interpretive link, deliberately assumed by the argument, and not an established date for the myth. The poem itself carries no such number. Two further comparisons belong to modern readers rather than to ancient scribes. The three god parties have been likened to the Greek arrangement between Zeus, taken as pure spirit or air, the leading party, and the groups around Poseidon, of water, and Hades, of earth. The same discussion compares the matter of contracts and tribute to the cattle divided between Prometheus and Zeus, and compares Enki's dismemberment of Geshtu-A to Plato's dissection of the rebellious spherical people into weak single individuals. Elegant parallels, all of them, and none of them a claim any Babylonian ever made. They are glosses laid over the text by people reading two literatures at once. The text's own history is less speculative and, in its way, more moving. The oldest known copy of the epic tradition concerning Atrahasis can be dated by its colophon, the scribe's closing note, to the reign of Ammi-Saduqa, the great-grandson of Hammurabi, who ruled from 1646 to 1626 BC. An old Babylonian copy written around 1650 BC is the most complete recension of the tale to have survived. Fragments in various old Babylonian dialects exist besides, and one more was recovered far to the west, at Ugarit. Assyrian dialect versions came to light in the library of Ashurbanipal, though their translation has remained uncertain because the tablets are fragmentary and some of the words in them are genuinely ambiguous. Copying continued into the first millennium BC. Scribes kept making new copies of a poem about a strike for well over 1,000 years. Somewhere in that long chain of hands, a student sat with a stylus and pressed into damp clay the line that a teacher had pressed before him, and another before that, when the gods had to work like humans. He may have been bored, he may have thought it was only an exercise. The garden with its half-dug watercourse, the pile of burning handles, the crowd standing quietly around a great house at night. All of it came down to us, because the copying did not stop, and the clay of the steppe is still there, under the canals, exactly where the poem says the first handful was taken from. There is a road that goes downward, and in the Sumerian poems, it is described the way a traveler describes a real journey. Gates, gatekeepers, garments removed one at a time. The one who takes it is Inanna, goddess of war, of love, of sex, holder of political power and divine law, the Queen of Heaven, whose symbols are the lion and the eight-pointed star. She goes down into the underworld, which is ruled by her older sister, Ereshkigal. And in this particular poem, when she arrives at the bottom, she is not met by a crowd. She is met by seven. Only 7 Anunnaki appear in Inanna's descent into the underworld. They live down there. That is their address in this text, not a place they visit. And they are not simply present as onlookers or as a chorus of shades. They are judges. Their business in that hall is judgment, and Inanna has arrived as the matter to be judged. Try to see the room without hurrying it. The throne room belongs to Ereshkigal, and Ereshkigal is the elder. That detail sits underneath the whole scene like a foundation stone. A younger sister has come down to the house of an older sister, and she has not come as a guest. The poem is explicit about what she came to do. She came to take the underworld. She came to add her sister's realm to her own domains in the way that so many of her other stories work, where she gathers what belongs to others into her own hands. The 7 do not argue with her. There is no long speech of accusation preserved as a great oratorical scene. They look at her, and the charge before them is her attempt to take over the underworld, and the finding they return is hubris, guilty. That is the whole legal substance of it. A claim overreached, a boundary crossed, a court that exists precisely to decide such things. Then they fasten their eyes on her, and she is dead, struck down. The Queen of Heaven, in the space of a single verdict, becomes a body in her sister's hall. Notice how cool it all is. There is no chase, no wrestling, no weapon named. A sentence is pronounced, and a goddess stops. If you have been waiting for the moment when the Anunnaki stop being a phrase in a hymn and actually do something as a body, this is it. 7 of them seated, deciding together, and the decision has immediate physical effect. They act the way a council acts. They do not need hands. Above, in the daylight world, someone was counting. Her name is Ninshubur, and she is Inanna's. Sukal, the attendant deity who carries messages, who goes ahead, who waits. Before descending, Inanna had given her instructions, and Ninshubur keeps them exactly. She waits 3 days. 3 days is not a long time in the life of an immortal, and it is an unbearable length of time when you are standing outside a door that does not open. When the 3 days have passed, Ninshubur does the only thing a servant can do. She goes to the gods and she asks. She asks all of them, every door in heaven, one after another. And this is the part of the story that quietly rearranges the shape of the pantheon, because every one of them refuses. Not one is willing to intervene. The reasons vary in the telling, but the result does not. The assembly, faced with a petition from a servant on behalf of a dead goddess, declines. The great council that decrees fates has nothing to offer. Ninshubur keeps walking. Enki answers. He is the god of wisdom and of crafts, of fresh subterranean waters, of magic and incantations, the one whose art is the finding of a solution when the obvious paths are closed. In art he is shown with streams of water pouring from his shoulders, or holding a vase from which water flows without ending. And that image says something true about how he works in the myths. He does not confront, he seeps around. His answer is not an army, it is a fabrication. He makes two beings who are neither male nor female, sexless creatures, with no place in any of the categories the underworld is built to catch, and he sends them down. The mechanism of the rescue is invention, something new, made for one purpose, small enough to slip through. They pass the gates. They reach Ereshkigal. They do what they were fashioned to do, and Inanna is restored, and they escort her back up the road she came down. There is a particular quality of stillness in that image, and the dark where you are lying is exactly the right place to receive it. A whole assembly of gods said no. One said yes, and what he sent was not power but cleverness, and the petitioner who unlocked it all was not a god of rank at all, but an attendant who refused to stop knocking. The Sumerians told this story for centuries. They knew what it meant that the door which opened was the one belonging to the god who liked people. But the underworld does not release without an exchange. That is the law of the place, older than the argument that brought Inanna into it, and it is the part of the story with teeth. Coming up with her are the Gala, the guardians of the underworld who go where she goes and watch. Someone must take her place. The accounting is simple, and it does not care about affection. As Inanna passes back through the world, they wait to see whom she will name. They take Dumuzid. He is her husband, and in the later Akkadian world, he is called Tammuz, and a Gala drag him down into the underworld as her replacement. That is the price of her return, not a payment in silver or grain, but a substitution of persons. One body up, one body down, and the ledger of the realm below stays balanced. What happens afterwards is the reason this myth outlived the language it was written in. Dumuzid is eventually permitted to come back, not permanently and not alone. He returns to heaven for half of the year. For the other half, his sister Geshtinana remains below in his place. The two of them alternate, one rising as the other descends, and neither is ever free at the same moment as the other. And that alternation, the poem says, is the cycle of the seasons. Think about what that means for a farmer standing on the Euphrates plain, watching the barley go grey and brittle in the heat, watching the canal water drop, waiting for the year to turn. The reason his field is dying is a judgment. A court sat, a goddess overreached, a sentence was passed, a substitution was arranged, and the consequence of that legal arrangement is the yellowing of grass. The seasons are the visible half of a case decided underground. When the green comes back, it is because someone was allowed up, and someone else went down in exchange. The world above breathes in and out along the rhythm of an underworld docket. There is something almost gentle in it, too, and something hard. Brother and sister take turns carrying the same debt. Neither escapes, neither is abandoned. The story traveled. Some centuries later, in the early second millennium, a shortened Akkadian version of the descent was written down, and in that version, the seven are not just a verdict machine, they are furniture and ceremony. They are hosted. Ereshkigal, speaking of her own life in the realm she rules, remarks that she drinks water with the Anunnaki. It is a domestic line, almost offhand, and it does more work than 100 lines of description. They are her company. They sit at water with her, the way household members sit together at the end of a day. Whatever terror belongs to them elsewhere, in her mouth, they are the ones she shares a cup with. Then, later in that same poem, she gives an order to her servant Namtar, and the order is a stage direction so precise that you can practically watch it being carried out. Go and fetch the Anunnaki from Igalgina. Decorate the threshold steps with coral. Seat them on golden thrones. Coral on the steps. Not paint, not cloth. Coral, hard branching stuff from the sea, laid along a threshold in a kingdom under the earth. And golden thrones, one for each of them, brought out and set in place before they arrive. Somebody in that house had to carry the thrones. Somebody had to arrange the coral. The Anunnaki are being received the way a delegation of high officials is received in a palace above ground. An escort sent, the entrance dressed, the seating prepared according to rank. Of all the places the Anunnaki appear in the surviving literature, this is the one you can actually see. There is no ancient portrait of them as a complete group. No such image has been found. But here is a text that tells you exactly how a room was to be prepared for them, and from that preparation, you can reconstruct the tableau, the polished threshold, the red branching stone, 7 seats of gold, and Ereshkigal waiting, and they are seen once more in the greatest of the Akkadian poems, around 1200 BCE, in the standard version of the Epic of Gilgamesh. The hero meets Utnapishtim, the man who survived the Great Flood and was given immortality for it. Utnapishtim tells him what the flood was like from inside it, and in his telling, the Anunnaki appear again as 7 judges of the underworld. The same office, the same number. What they do is set the land aflame as the storm comes on. It is one of the strangest and most memorable images the literature preserves. Before the water, fire. The sky goes black and the wind gathers, and along the horizon, the 7 raise their torches, so that the whole country is lit from below, while the storm rolls over it. Anyone who had ever watched weather come across that flat plain would understand the picture instantly. The light does not comfort. It shows you the size of what is arriving. Then the water comes, and it takes everything, and the tone of the poem changes completely. Ishtar, the goddess we have been following under her Sumerian name, conflated with Inanna and worshipped under both, cries out over what has been done to humanity, and the Anunnaki weep with her. The same seven who lit the land now mourn the people who lived on it. They sit in the aftermath, gods without a purpose for the moment, grieving a species they helped to drown. The texts never resolve this, and that is not an oversight. It is the shape of how these gods were understood. Seven figures who look at a goddess and end her. Seven figures who cannot look at a flooded plain without weeping. It is the same body doing the work of a court and then failing to be indifferent to its own sentence. The Mesopotamians did not seem to find this inconsistent. Their gods governed the way their own assemblies governed, by deliberation, by finding, by a decision taken together that no single member owns afterwards. And anyone who has ever sat in such a body knows the peculiar grief of it. The verdict is correct. The verdict is collective, and still the person who carries it home carries it alone. Somewhere between the coral on those threshold steps and the torchlight on the horizon, the Anunnaki become something more human than a committee of powers. They receive guests. They drink water with a queen. They condemn. They mourn. And on the plain above, the barley continues doing what it has always done, greening, ripening, dying back, greening again, because two siblings, long ago, agreed to take turns in the dark. There is a word for what a god looked like, and it is not a word about faces. The gods of Mesopotamia were human in shape. That is the first thing to hold, because so much later imagining has crowded around them. They were not animal-headed, not abstract, not clouds of light with no body inside. They had shoulders and hands and hair. They wore clothes. They sat and stood and traveled, and their feet touched floors. What separated them from the people who knelt before them was not anatomy, but scale and radiance. They were envisioned as enormous, tremendous in physical size, the way a storm front is enormous, filling the whole upper part of the mind's eye. And they were covered in something the Sumerians called Melam. The Melam is an ambiguous substance. That vagueness is not a failure of the sources, it is the nature of the thing. It is best imagined not as a halo, not as a disk of gold hovering behind a head, but as something worn, a radiance put on like a garment, lying over the body, moving as the body moves. A shine that belongs to the wearer and can be taken off, and it was not the exclusive property of gods. Heroes wore it, kings wore it, giants wore it, even demons wore it. It was closer to a rank than to a soul, and the effect of that radiance on a human being had its own name. Ni. The word describes the physical tingling of the flesh, not awe as an idea, not reverence as a posture, the small electrical crawl across the forearms, the tightening at the back of the neck, the hair lifting on the skin. If you have ever felt that in a doorway at night, for no reason you could name, you already know the sensation the Sumerians were describing. Their theology had a bodily test built into it. The correct mortal response to a god is goosebumps. You can see the rest of the picture on the carved stone that survives. Almost always, A deity wears a horned cap, a conical headdress ringed with pairs of ox horns, laid one above another, sometimes as many as 7 superimposed pairs. Nothing else in the visual language says God so quickly. The horns were an important marker of divinity, and gods had been shown wearing them from the 3rd millennium BC onward. Sometimes the clothing is elaborated further, robes with decorative ornaments of gold and silver sewn into the cloth, so the figure catches light from every angle, a made object standing in for an unmade one. What is remarkable about the horned cap is how little it moved. Fashions changed, dynasties fell, the language of government shifted from Sumerian to Akkadian and back and away again. The cap held. It kept its form and its meaning from the earliest days of Sumerian prehistory right up to the Persian conquest and beyond, roughly 3,000 years of agreement about what the mark of a god looks like. Very few images anywhere have been believed in that steadily by that many generations without drifting. So the radiance had a shape, and the shape had a house. A god statue in Mesopotamian thought was not a portrait, it was a physical embodiment of the god himself, not a reminder of a distant power, but the place where that power was actually located. And the temple was not a meeting hall. It was the deity's literal residence, the address at which he or she could be found living. Virtually every major deity of the Sumerian pantheon was patron of a specific city, expected to guard that city's interests, and believed to dwell permanently inside its temple. The god had a hometown, the way a person does, which meant that the god had a household, and households have routines. A set of priests was assigned to each cult statue, and their duties were domestic before they were mystical. They dressed the statue and changed its clothing when the season or the rite required. They set feasts before it so that the god could eat. The food was laid out ritually, in the form of a proper meal, the day's bread and drink and meat arranged before the divine figure, offered, left in the god's presence for the god's consumption, and afterwards, when the ritual portion of the meal was complete, the food was distributed among the priests who had prepared it. That is the quiet mechanism at the heart of a temple economy. The god is fed, and the god's servants eat. The gods also traveled. Inside their temples they kept boats, not models, but full-sized barges, stored under the temple roof, brought out to carry the cult statues along the waterways during religious festivals. Picture the canal at dusk and the great shape moving on it, torchlit, the crowd on the banks in that same tingling silence. For journeys over land there were chariots, and sometimes, when a war was underway, a statue would be carried out to the site of a battle, set where the fighting could be seen, so that the deity might watch the engagement unfold with his own eyes. Underneath all of it, the dressing, the feeding, the ferrying, sits a single inherited doctrine, and it is a stark one. The Sumerians believed that humanity's sole purpose was to serve the gods, not to please them, not to petition them primarily, but to work for them. Every meal set before a statue is a small repayment of an ancient labor contract. The theology and the housekeeping were the same activity. Now, of all those houses, one refused to build a second. Nippur sat in the alluvial plain, and at its center stood the Ekur, the chief temple of Enlil. The name means, in plain ancient Sumerian, mountain house, and it was believed to have been built and established by Enlil himself, which put it in a different category from any structure raised by a king. It was regarded as the mooring rope of heaven and earth. That is a river image, and a very exact one, the rope that holds a moving vessel to a fixed bank. Heaven and earth were understood to be tied together at that spot, and the temple was a channel of communication between the two. A hymn written during the reign of Nammu, founder of the third dynasty of describes the place in some detail. Its gates, the hymn says, were carved with Imdugud slaying a lion and with an eagle snatching up a sinner. Consider what it means to walk through that doorway on temple business, to pass beneath a bird of prey with a guilty man in its claws on your way to ask a favor of the Lord of the Air. Whoever cut those reliefs knew precisely what a threshold is for. And Nippur, alone among the Sumerian city-states, never built a palace. Every other city had one, a seat for the human ruler, a place from which the Lugal or the NC governed. Nippur simply did not raise the building. The absence was the statement. It showed that the city's king was Enlil himself, resident in the Ekur, requiring no earthly counterpart with a throne room down the road. The consequence was political, and it lasted an extraordinarily long time. Rulers from all over Sumer traveled to Nippur to be legitimized, to have their kingship recognized at the temple of the god who held authority over the whole land. Having received Enlil's favor, they repaid it. Lands signed over to the temple, precious objects laid up in it. And when the map changed and Babylon rose, when Marduk had superseded Enlil as supreme god of the pantheon, the habit did not break. Babylonian kings still made the journey to the holy city of Nippur to seek recognition of their right to rule. The god had been demoted upstairs, and the road to his door stayed busy anyway. It is worth knowing who exactly they were coming to see. He is called Nunamnir. He is called the Great Mountain, Kurgal, and King of the Foreign Lands. The hymns describe him as a raging storm and as a wild bull, and also, unexpectedly, as a merchant. At least one text calls him the East Wind and the North Wind, as though he were not one weather, but the whole compass of moving air. The Mesopotamians envisioned him as creator, as father, as king, as the supreme lord of the universe. They also envisioned him as a benevolent and fatherly deity who watches over humanity and cares about their well-being, a god who was thought to be supremely just, intolerant towards evil, and worth copying, so that kings held him up as a model ruler and tried to govern in his manner. He was credited with the invention of the mattock and regarded as the patron of agriculture, which is to say that the lord of the storm was also the lord of the hoe, And the same hands that made the sky move showed people how to break the ground. One Sumerian hymn goes further than praise. It says, Enlil was so holy, so glorious, that not even the other gods could look upon him. And it adds that without Enlil, civilization could not exist at all. The numbers around him are worth keeping. 50 was his sacred number, in a numerological system where certain figures were believed to hold ritual significance of their own. Overhead, he was associated with the constellation Bootes, and he formed a triad with An and Enki. The three of them together understood as the embodiment of all the fixed stars in the night sky, which is a fine thing to hold in mind if you are lying in the dark. 3 gods, and every steady point of light between them. And then, having assembled all of that, the honest part. Nobody is certain what his name means. It is built from En, Lord, joined to Lil. Lil is contentious. One reading takes it as wind in the plain meteorological sense, which makes him Lord Wind or Lord Storm. Another takes it as a spirit or phantom, a presence you would notice as a faint stirring of the air in a still room, a subtler and stranger thing. A third possibility is that Lil is not properly Sumerian at all, but a partial Semitic loanword sitting inside a Sumerian name. The grammar adds one clue. The name is not a genitive construction. Enlil is not Lord of Lil. He appears to have been the personification of Lil, not merely its cause. Piotr Steinkeller has suggested that the word may not be a clue to a divine domain in the first place, since Enlil may have been what he calls a typical universal god, without any specific domain at all, power in general rather than power over something. Steinkeller and Piotr Michałowski have both raised doubts about whether Enlil is Sumerian in origin, questioning the true meaning of the name and connecting it with the Eblate word Lilu. Manfred Krebenik and M.P. Streck have noted that his epithet Kurgal, the Great Mountain, hints that he might have come from eastern Mesopotamia, because the flat southern plain has no mountains to name a god after. The supreme lord of the universe, and we cannot say for certain what his name means or where he came from. There is something restful in that, if you let it be restful. The record is old enough to have lost its own beginning. Far to the south, where the plain gives out, the other pole of Sumerian devotion stood almost in the water. Eridu lay on the coast of the Persian Gulf and was considered one of the oldest cities of all. It was regarded as the home of Enki, his main cult center, the place he lived. And his temple there was the Abzu, named for the Abzu, the body of fresh water beneath the earth that he was believed to rule. What makes Eridu worth lingering in is not only its age, but its mixture. At Eridu, 3 separate ways of living may have fused into one settlement. There were peasant farmers of the Ubaidian kind, living in mud brick huts and practicing irrigation, people whose whole year turned on the cutting and clearing of channels. There were mobile Semitic pastoralists living in black tents, moving with herds of sheep and goats across the margins, and there were fisher folk in the marshlands, living in huts made of reeds, who may have been the ancestors of the Sumerians themselves. Mud brick, black cloth, bundled reed. 3 ways of living in the same landscape. 3 textures of daily life meeting in a single place. 3 smells of smoke. 3 kinds of quiet at night. 3 different senses of where the important water is. A city where those 3 met would inherit all 3 appetites at once. And the god who lived there was, fittingly, the god of the water that no one can see. Enki was the god of wisdom and of crafts, of fresh subterranean waters, of magic and of incantations. In art, he is commonly shown with streams of water flowing from his body, or holding a vase from which water pours, the spring made portable, carried in the arms. His symbols are the goatfish, the ram-headed staff, and the turtle, creatures of the boundary between element and element, half in and half out. His attendant, his Sukkal, was Isimud. Among his servants were the Lahmu, the Kululu, and the 7 sages. His wife was Damgalnuna, and their children included Nanshe, Asaluhi, Marduk, and Enbilulu, which means, among other things, that the god of Eridu's marshes fathered the god who would one day rule Babylon. His names carry the same open questions as Enlil's, and rather more of them. He is very often called Nudimmud, a name used almost exclusively in literary texts, though Akkadian sources place it in royal inscriptions, prayers, and incantations too. The elements are read as to build, create, and to bring forth, and one god list, An equal Anumsha Ameli, explains Nudimmud as Ea in his aspect as god of creation. Earlier spellings of the name are attested that do not match the standard later writing, and Antoine Cavignon and Manfred Krebenik have remarked that the familiar orthography and the translation drawn from it likely reflect a later etymological reinterpretation, which is to say, the meaning may have been fitted to the name afterwards, the way a story gets attached to an old scar. He is also called Nagbu, source, spring, a name for his lordship over the springs and the waters below, tied to irrigation and fertility, and, just as closely, to incantation, since subterranean water played an important part in Mesopotamian magic. It is unclear whether Nagbu began as an independent deity and was absorbed, or was always an aspect of Ea, and he is called Nishiku, first attested in literary texts of the Old Babylonian period, of frankly uncertain meaning. A later variant, Ninshiku, is likely a folk etymology reading the ending as the Sumerian word for wise. Even the plain name resists. Enki is usually translated Lord of the Earth, but that reading is not universally accepted, and some scholars argue it does not fit what the god actually does. Edmund Solberger read the second element differently and rendered the name as something nearer to Lord Benevolence, arguing that it reflects Enki's well-attested character as a friend of mankind. That proposal has not been generally accepted either, and behind all of this stands one agreed point that unsettles the rest. Enki and Ea were originally 2 separate deities. When exactly they were fully equated, nobody knows. So the two great houses of Sumer stand at either end of the plain, the mountain house with no palace beside it, and the house above the deep water where the tents and the reed huts met. In both of them, a figure of human shape and impossible size waits in the dark of an inner room, dressed by hand, fed at the proper hour, wearing a radiance that a mortal recognizes not with the mind, but with the skin. There is another name in these tablets, and it has been standing just at the edge of the lamplight this whole while. The Igigi. They are figures of heaven in the Mesopotamian texts, and almost everything about them is quieter and less certain than the fame of their older cousins. Their name has no known origin. Nobody can say what language it came from, or what it once meant to the mouth that first said it. It was written at first as Igigi, and later also in a second spelling, Igigi. And that second spelling is the sort of thing a scribe does when he is enjoying his work, because those signs can be read as numbers. Taken one way, added together, they come to 7, the number of the great gods. Taken another way, multiplied instead of added, they come to 600, which in some traditions is the total number of gods there are. A single written name, 3 small marks in clay, holding both the smallest sacred council and the whole population of heaven, depending on how you choose to read it. Whether the scribes intended that, or whether it is a coincidence that later readers found beautiful, cannot be settled. But the spelling exists, and the arithmetic works, and somebody in Babylon almost certainly noticed. What the Igigi actually did is not clearly defined anywhere. They have no settled job. They are a set, introduced as a group in the old Babylonian period, a new collective arriving in the record long after the world was already full of gods. Their name turns up woven into the names of ordinary people, the way a parent might build a god into a child's name as a small permanent blessing. Somebody's son walked the streets of a mud brick city carrying the Igigi in his own name, and we still have that name, and we still do not know precisely what he thought he was invoking. And they have an address. This is the detail that makes them suddenly solid. Topographical texts, the dry lists that record what stands where, the ancient equivalent of walking a district and writing down each building, mention Eduokuga, in Sumerian Eduokuga, the house of the sacred brick, a sanctuary of the Igigi in Babylon, in the district called Te-Eti. Not a metaphor, a structure in a named quarter of a real city, with a doorway somebody swept and a threshold somebody crossed, with an offering in both hands. That inversion deserves a moment of plain attention before the rest of it follows. The vaguer, later, less defined collective has a building. The famous one does not. For all the weight the Anunnaki carry in the literature, the fate decreeing, the judging, the assemblies, no sanctuary of theirs as a body has been found. The Igigi, whose functions nobody can pin down, have the house of the sacred brick. The relationship between the two names is the genuinely difficult part, and the honest answer is that it shifts. Sometimes the words are simply synonyms, two ways of saying the gods with a slightly different weight of formality, the way a language will keep two words for the same thing and let poets choose between them. Elsewhere, they are sharply divided. In the Atrahasis tradition, the Igigi are the sixth generation of the gods, the younger ones, set to labor for the Anunnaki until they refuse, a hierarchy with a grievance running through the middle of it. And in the poem of Era, from the 8th century before our era, the distinction is drawn cleanly, no blurring at the edges. There the Anunnaki are named as the brothers of Nergal, and they are not kindly. That poem shows them as antagonistic towards humanity, which is a long way from the older picture of a council that decrees the fates of mankind. Then comes the change that reshaped everything, and it happened slowly enough that no one alive would have felt it happen. From the Middle Babylonian period onward, roughly the 16th to the 12th centuries before our era, the name Anunnaki came to be applied generally to the deities of the underworld, and the name Igigi came to be applied to the deities of heaven. The two collectives swapped floors. Think about what that means for the beings themselves. They began as heavenly gods of immense power, the most important names in the pantheon, the descendants of the sky. They ended as the court below, the ones who sit in the dark and hear cases. It is not that their nature changed. Nobody in the texts describes a fall or a punishment or a war that sent them downward. Their address changed. The word moved house, and the meaning went with it, and every reader who came afterward opened the later tablets first and assumed that the underworld had always been where they belonged. That assumption is still with us. It is why so much of what gets said about the Anunnaki begins underground. The oldest layer of the tradition puts them in heaven, and it is the newer layer, newer by a mere 1,000 years or so, that has done most of the talking ever since. Now let me take you to Nippur, on a badly damaged tablet from the Neo-Assyrian period, somewhere in the 3 centuries between 911 and 612 before our era. Damaged is the word to hold on to. The story survives in pieces, and the pieces are extraordinary. Marduk leads his army of Anunnaki into the sacred city of Nippur. He causes a disturbance there, and here the text is doing something that a modern reader has to slow down for, because in this account, the Anunnaki are Marduk's soldiers, a force under a commander, marching into somebody else's holy ground. The disturbance causes a flood. That is the sequence as the tablet gives it. The trouble comes first, and the water follows out of it, the way trouble does in a country of canals. The resident gods of Nippur take shelter. They go into Eshumesha, the temple of Ninurta, and the image is domestic and almost tender. Divinities crowding into a building to get out of the rising water, the way a household climbs to the roof. Enlil is enraged. This is his city, and the transgression is against his own place. He orders the gods sheltering in Eshumesha to take Marduk and the other Anunnaki as prisoners, and they do. The capture succeeds. If the tablet ended there, it would be a simple story about a boundary respected. It does not end there. Marduk, imprisoned, appoints his front-runner, a god named Mushteshir-Hablim, to lead a revolt against the gods of Eshumesha. And then he sends a messenger, Neretagmil, to alert Nammu, the god of literacy, the god of writing itself, brought into a war as a signal. When the Eshumesha gods hear Nammu speak, they come out of their temple to search for him. That is the whole of the trap. A voice outside, a curiosity, a door opened, and the shelter is no longer a shelter. The ambush closes. Marduk defeats them and takes 360 of them as prisoners of war. Enlil is among them, the separator of heaven and earth, the lord of Nippur, led away with the rest. Enlil protests that the gods of Eshumesha are innocent, that they only did as they were told, that the fault was never theirs, and Marduk answers that protest in the most formal way available to him. He puts them on trial before the Anunnaki. There is the tribunal again, the body that judges, seated once more, but now it is the victor's court, convened by the winner, hearing the case of the losers. The same institution that decrees fates in the oldest hymns is here doing what courts do when the army that convened them is standing at the back of the room. The tablet ends with a warning. It comes from Damkiana, which is another name for Ninhursag, and she addresses it to the gods and to humanity together. Never do this again. Never repeat the war between the Anunnaki and the gods of Eshumesha. A mother goddess closing a war story, not with a verdict, but with a plea, spoken across the divide, to both kinds of listener at once. And then the clay breaks, and we have no more of her. The rest of this moves at the pace of deep water, a long, slow tide that carries everything forward, whether the mind is fully present or not. Because the frame around all of it is a stretch of time so long that the mind slides off it. The Ubaid period runs from roughly 6500 to 4100 before our era, though some sources close it around 3800 instead, and that disagreement of 3 centuries is itself a good measure of how far back we are reaching. What we can recognize as Mesopotamian religion appears with writing around 3500. Then the Uruk period, and Jemdet Nasser after it, and then the early dynastic centuries stretching down through the 3rd millennium, city-states divided by canals and boundary stones, each with its temple and its patron. Sargon of Akkad rises around 2335, and the Akkadian Empire becomes the first state to hold large parts of Mesopotamia together. In that same 24th century, Enlil first rises to prominence as the importance of An begins to wane and Nippur grows into itself. Then the Gutian interval, brief and dim. Then Ur-3, roughly 2119 to 2004, when the cult of Enki is especially influential, and when, in inscriptions from the reign of Gudea and from that 3rd dynasty, the word Anunnaki appears in writing for the first time we can point to. The Amorite centuries follow, and Enlil is still supreme through them, with monarchs proclaiming him as the source of their right to rule. Then Hammurabi conquers Sumer, and Enlil's importance begins to wane. not to vanish, only to thin. In the Kassite period, Nippur briefly recovers its influence, and Enlil rises again with it, an old god given one more season. From around 1300, he is syncretized with Ashur, the national god of Assyria, his character folded into another name in another country. In 1230, the Elamites attack Nippur. The city falls into decline, and the cult of Enlil goes down with the city, because in this world a god's fortune and his town's fortune are the same fortune. About 100 years after that sack, the headship of the pantheon passes to Marduk, the national god of Babylon. And in the literature of that new order, it is said that the Anunnaki, the great gods, built for him the splendid temple Ereshkigal in gratitude, dedicated to Marduk and to Ea and to Enlil. The collective that judged and decreed appears one more time as builders, raising a house for the god who replaced the god they had once served. Then the long ending. In 539, the Achaemenid Empire under Cyrus takes Mesopotamia, closing more than 3,000 years of Mesopotamian dominance in the Near East. Though the Persians left the native culture and religion largely alone, so the temples went on with their feasts and their clothed statues under a new flag. In 330, Alexander overthrows the Persians and takes the country in his turn. Under the Parthians, there is a genuine revival in Assyria. Temples dedicated once again to Ashur, Sin, Shamash, Hadad, Bel, and Ishtar in the vassal states. Old names lit up again, centuries after anyone would have predicted it. And then the slow close, with Christianity spreading through the region and Mesopotamian religion declining between the 1st and 5th centuries of our era. Not a single day when it stopped. No last priest with a torch. Just fewer offerings laid out, fewer statues clothed, fewer children given names built out of the Igigi, until the House of the Sacred Brick was a building in a district that people passed without looking at. The names survived anyway, because they had been pressed into clay, and clay is patient. Anunnaki above, then below. Igigi below, then above. Two words that traded places over a span longer than most civilizations managed to exist at all, and went on, holding their meanings in the dark, long after the last person who knew the difference had stopped explaining it to anyone. A word can travel further than the people who made it. Carry it north, out of the alluvial plain, up past the last of the canals and the boundary stones, into the highlands, where the rivers run fast and cold, and the houses are built of stone rather than river mud, and the word arrives. But it arrives changed, the way a coin arrives, worn smooth in a foreign purse. In the middle and later centuries of the second millennium, before the Common Era, in the kingdoms of the Hurrians and the Hittites, scribes sat with their reed styli and their damp tablets and wrote of gods they had inherited rather than invented. They knew the old Mesopotamian names. They had the epics, the god lists, the shapes of the divine assembly. And when they came to describe a particular set of deities in their own mythology, the oldest generation, the ones who had held power first and then lost it. They reached for the Mesopotamian term and set it down as an equivalent. Those elder gods, in the Hittite scribal understanding, were the Anunnaki. The story those scribes were telling is a story of succession and of losing. In Hurrian and Hittite myth, the oldest generation of gods was banished by the younger gods, driven down out of the bright upper world and into the underworld, where they remain. That is the whole of their situation. They were first, and then they were not, and the place they went afterwards is beneath the ground. In the Hurrian language they carry two descriptions, and both are quietly devastating in their plainness. They are Karuilesh Shunesh, the former ancient gods, and they are Kataresh Shunesh, the gods of the earth, not gods of the sky, not gods of the storm, or of the grain harvest, or of any particular city's prosperity. Gods of the earth, meaning gods of what lies under it, meaning gods who are addressed downward. They are always 8. Whatever else shifts in the Hurro-Hittite material, and a good deal shifts, since these were living traditions copied and recopied across generations of scribes, the number holds 8 former gods. Their names, though, vary from text to text, with a freedom that suggests the roster was never quite fixed, that the number mattered more than the membership. Below, they are ruled by the goddess Lelwani, who holds the underworld the way a resident holds a house. Something has happened here that is easy to miss and worth turning over slowly. A foreign scribal culture picked up a Mesopotamian word, a word that in its homeland had once meant the highest gods, the ones who decreed fates from above, and fastened it permanently to the losers of a divine succession. The word became the name for the defeated party, and once a word is used that way often enough, on tablet after tablet, by scribes who have no memory of what it meant 3 cities and 600 years away, the new meaning is simply what the word means. So how do you make an offering to gods who have no house? Because they had none. In Hurro-Hittite religion, the old gods had no identifiable cult of their own. No temple standing in the middle of a town with a statue inside it to be dressed and fed each morning. No priesthood, no processional barge, no festival calendar, which leaves a practical problem for anyone who needs to reach them. You cannot climb the steps of a sanctuary that was never built. You cannot leave bread on a table that does not exist. What the Hurrians and Hittites did instead was dig a pit cut into the ground, not a hearth, not an altar, not a raised platform with the smoke rising up toward whatever sits above the clouds. The exact opposite of that, in every direction. A hole opened downward into the same earth the old gods had been pushed into. Into that pit went a piglet, offered in sacrifice. It is a small, homely, unglamorous animal, and the gesture is entirely coherent. The address matches the recipient. Gods who live beneath receive from beneath. Every other offering in the ancient world travels upward as smoke, or sits at eye level on a table. This one goes the other way, down through the cut soil, following the same route the old gods themselves took when they fell. And what were they asked for, these deposed ancients with no temple and no festival? Two things, mainly, and both of them make a certain sense once you have been thinking about the underworld for a while. They were invoked to perform ritual purifications, to take away what should not remain, and the direction they would take it in is obvious enough. There is a logic in asking the gods of below to receive what you want removed from above, and they were called upon as witnesses. Hittite and Hurrian treaties were frequently sworn by the old gods, so that the oaths would be kept. 2 kings, 2 seals, a list of obligations, and behind it all, a row of ancient powers who had once been overthrown themselves, standing surety that this new arrangement would hold. Kings who knew exactly how a settled order can be broken chose, as the guarantors of their promises, the gods who had lost their own. One Hittite ritual does something the entire Sumerian record never does for its own Anunnaki. It names them, all of them. It lists the old gods one after another, a complete company, and the list runs like this: Aduntari the diviner, Zulki the dream interpretess, Irpitia, lord of the earth, Nara, Namshara, Minki, Amunki, and Api. 8 names, and the first 2 of them have occupations: a reader of signs and a reader of dreams, which are the 2 crafts a person turns to when they need to know something the daylight will not tell them. It is a strange and lovely small irony of the record that the tidy roster we have, the one you could count on your fingers, comes not from Sumer at all, but from a Hittite scribe writing in a highland kingdom, in a language unrelated to Sumerian, about gods he had inherited second-hand. The names will keep, whether you catch them clearly or receive them only at the edge of sleep. There are only 2 more turns in this, and both are quiet ones. Down in that lower world, the former gods are not entirely idle. In one myth, the gods of the upper world find themselves threatened by Ulikumi, a giant made of stone, an enemy that grows and cannot be reasoned with and does not tire. The one who solves it is Ea, which is the later Akkadian name for Enki, appearing here, as he so often appears elsewhere, as the counselor who thinks of the thing nobody else has thought of. His instruction to the former gods is a piece of memory rather than a piece of strategy. Go and find the weapon, he tells them, the one that was used at the very beginning of things to cut heaven and earth apart from each other. That is a tool of cosmology. It is the instrument of the first division, the one that made a sky above and a ground below, and therefore made a world with room in it. And it has been lying somewhere all this time, in the keeping of the generation old enough to remember where it was put. They find it, and they use it not to divide a cosmos, but to cut off a stone giant's feet, to take the base out from under him, so that the thing which had been growing upward can no longer stand. The blade that once opened the universe brought back out for a single surgical task. It is the only kind of usefulness the defeated are left with. They know where the old things are kept. And there is one more resonance, running west. The Hittite account of the elder god's banishment is closely related to a story you may already half know from another shore entirely, Hesiod's Theogony. The narrative of the Titans, the previous generation, overthrown and put away by the Olympians who came after. The relationship is not a matter of general resemblance. It runs through the names themselves. The Greek sky god Oranos, whose name means simply heaven, is the father of the Titans, and Oranos derives from the Hittite version of Anu. In Hesiod's telling, Oranos is castrated by his son Cronus, and the succession passes downward through that mutilation. In the Hittite story, Anu is castrated by his son Kumarbi, and the same thing happens in the same order for the same reason. The Hurrians, for their part, had already matched their Kumarbi with Enlil, the oldest of the Anunnaki, and the god who split heaven from earth in the first place. Which means that when a Greek poet sang about the elder gods being put away beneath the world, he was singing, at some distance he could not have measured, a version of something written in wedge-shaped marks on wet clay in the flatlands between two rivers. The word traveled and altered. In the south, it had meant the highest of the high, the ones who decree. In the highlands, it came to mean the buried and the outvoted. 8 of them, without a temple between them, reached only through a pit in the ground. And further west still, the shape of their story surfaced again, in a language that had never heard the word at all, in a poem about Titans, with nobody left to say where any of it began. Some things sink out of sight and go on holding the structure up from underneath. A lecture room on the 17th of January in the year 1869. A scholar named Jules Oppert stands and says a word that has not been used as the name of a people for something close to 2,000 years. Sumer. He is the first to publish it, and in publishing it, he gives a name to a gap, a hole in the record where a civilization had been, unremembered, unnamed, quietly waiting under the silt of southern Mesopotamia, while the world above it forgot that it had ever existed. That is where all of this begins for us, and it's a strange thing to sit with in the dark. Every tablet, every hymn, every quarrel among gods that has ever been recited in a warm room like this one had first to be dug out of the ground and taught to speak again. The Sumerians were entirely unknown during the early period of modern archaeology, not misunderstood, unknown. There was no legend of them, no inherited memory, no line of kings passed down in some later chronicle to keep the shape of them alive. The whole civilization had to be recovered, piece by baked clay piece, by men with trowels and lamps and a great deal of patience. 8 years after Oppert's lecture, in 1877, the French archaeologist Ernest de Sarzec began the first major excavation of a Sumerian city at Girsu. Think of what that work actually looked like. A low mound in a flat country, indistinguishable at a distance from any other rise in the plain, and beneath it, walls of mud brick the same color as the earth pressed against them. There is no marble in southern Mesopotamia, no quarried stone waiting to be cleared of dust. There is river mud, shaped and dried, and the archaeologist's difficulty is that a wall of dried river mud, after 4,000 years, is very nearly the same substance as the ground it stands in. You learn to read a change in texture. You learn to feel the difference between soil and brick through the handle of a tool. What came out of Gersu, and out of the sites that followed, was writing, wedges pressed into damp clay by a cut reed, then dried or burned hard, and being clay, more or less immortal in a way that parchment and papyrus never are. Fire destroys a library of scrolls. Fire bakes a library of tablets and preserves it. In 1884, Leon Hoysey published the findings of de Sarzec's work, and the material began moving out of the ground and into the reading rooms, where a different and slower kind of excavation could start. From 1889 to 1900, John Punnett Peters of the University of Pennsylvania excavated Nippur, Enlil's own city, the place that had never built a palace, because the king of that city was understood to be the god himself. 11 seasons of work in a landscape of heat and dust and drifting sand, and out of it came tablets in numbers that would keep scholars occupied for generations. Some of those texts had lain there since the city's own scribes filed them. Some had been broken before ever being buried, so that a single composition might survive as fragments scattered across 3 separate rooms or across 2 separate museums in 2 separate countries, waiting for someone to notice that the edges matched. Meanwhile, the names themselves were being corrected. In 1899, Heinrich Zimmern established that the flood hero of the Akkadian epic should properly be read as Atrahasis, exceedingly wise, a small adjustment of syllables that let a scattered body of fragments finally be recognized as one poem rather than several. In 1902 and 1903, the German archaeologist Robert Koldewey dug at Shurupak, the city that the King List names as Atrahasis's own. In 1905, François Thureau d'Angers published the inscriptions of Sumer and Akkad, gathering into one volume the royal texts that had been surfacing city by city. And in 1923, Arno Pobel produced a grammar of Sumerian, an outline of the bones of a language that belongs to no family at all, that is neither Semitic nor Indo-European, that has no living relatives anywhere on earth and never did have, so far as anyone can show. Learning it was not like learning Latin. There was no chain of speakers, no descendant tongue to reason backwards from. There was only the language itself, and the immense good fortune that the Akkadians, whose own tongue was Semitic and therefore comparable to others, had kept Sumerian on as a sacred and scholarly language, and had left behind bilingual lists, sign here, meaning there, in a language the modern world could get a grip on. The Sumerians taught us to read them through their students. The flood epic came together the same way, in pieces, out of order. George Smith first assembled and translated the fragments of the Atrahasis material as the Chaldean account of Genesis. And the world discovered that the ark and the rain had older cousins in a language nobody had known existed a generation earlier, but the epic remained partial for a long time after that, full of gaps, uncertain lines, tablets broken exactly where the sense turned. Then, in 1965, Wilfrid Lambert and Alan Millard published many further Atrahasis texts, among them an old Babylonian copy written about 1650 BC, the most complete surviving version of the tale. Their work became the basis of the first English translation of the epic in something approaching entirety. Nearly a century of digging and comparing had passed between Oppert saying the word and a reader in an ordinary room being able to follow the argument of the gods from beginning to end. Hold that image gently as you settle, a poem broken into hundreds of pieces across 4,000 years, reassembled by people who never met each other, working in different countries and different decades, each handing forward a slightly less broken version than the one they received. There is no drama in it. It is patience, applied for 100 years, and it was into that long, slow, unfinished work, precise, cautious, hedged with question marks, that a very different kind of storyteller walked. In 1968, a Swiss writer named Erich von Daniken published the first of a series of books, Chariots of the Gods, in which he claimed that extraterrestrial visitors, ancient astronauts in his phrase, had come to a prehistoric Earth. Religion itself, he claimed, was the residue of that encounter, the origins of faiths everywhere explained as the reactions of frightened, dazzled people to contact with an alien race. He offered readings of Sumerian texts and of the Old Testament as his evidence. The books sold, and the idea entered the general air. Then came the man whose name is now welded to the Anunnaki in the modern imagination. Zecharia Sitchin was born in the summer of 1920 to a Jewish family in Baku, the capital of what was then Soviet Azerbaijan, and was raised in Mandatory Palestine. By his own account, given in an interview with the New York Times, he took a degree in economics from the University of London and worked as an editor and a journalist in Israel before moving to New York in 1952. He earned his living as an executive for a shipping company, and in his own hours, without formal training, he taught himself Sumerian cuneiform and traveled to several archaeological sites. There is something almost affecting in that picture. A shipping executive bent over sign, lists after work, teaching himself the oldest written language on earth. It's the sort of self-education one wants to admire. What he built with it is another matter. In 1976 he published The 12th Planet, and in it he claimed that the Anunnaki were not gods at all, and not metaphors, and not a literary category, but an advanced humanoid extraterrestrial species. Their home, he claimed, was an undiscovered planet named Nibiru, lying beyond Neptune, following a long elliptical orbit tilted to the south, part of it carrying north of Earth's equator, and returning to the inner solar system roughly every 3,600 years. Every claim in that sentence is his, and none of it is anything the tablets say. The account grew from there and grew elaborate. Nibiru, he claimed, was a rogue planet, captured by the sun shortly after the solar system formed. In his reading, Tiamat, the mother of the gods, the one whose body Marduk divides in the Babylonian creation poem, was not a mythological being, but another planet, once orbiting between Mars and Jupiter. He claimed the two collided. Struck by one of Nibiru's moons, Tiamat split in two. On a second pass, Nibiru itself struck the broken fragments, and one half became the asteroid belt, while the other half, struck again, was pushed into a new orbit and became the Earth we stand on. The comets, he claimed, came from the same wreck. He speculated further that Pluto, which he identified with both Gaga and Isimud, the latter being, in the actual texts, the two-faced attendant of Enki, had once been a satellite of Saturn, dislodged by Nibiru's gravity and flung outward into its odd, crossing path near Neptune. He claimed the Sumerians counted 12 bodies in their sky, and that the Babylonians later substituted the name Marduk for Nibiru, a ruler of that name co-opting the creation of the world for himself. Then the people. Sitchin claimed the Anunnaki were the Nephilim named in Genesis. He claimed they came to Earth perhaps 450,000 years ago, seeking minerals and gold above all, that they found it and mined it in Africa, that they built a base of operations, and that the beings the Sumerians called gods were in fact the rank and file of a colonial mining expedition. He claimed that these workers mutinied over the conditions of their labor, and that Enki proposed a solution: the creation of a primitive worker made by crossing extraterrestrial genes with those of Homo erectus, a slave species raised up to swing the picks in place of the mutineers. The rest of his chronology followed the same method. Take a scene from the tablets and read it as an engineering report. The flood, he claimed, came when Antarctic glaciers melted, forcing the Anunnaki to abandon the surface and orbit the planet while the water rose, destroying their bases. Rebuilding them required more hands, so, he claimed, they taught humanity agriculture. Kingship, in his account, was inaugurated as an institution of intermediaries, a chain of command between the mining company and its workforce. The origin, he said, of the doctrine of the divine right of kings. The evil wind that desolates the city in the lament for he believed, was radioactive fallout from nuclear weapons used in a war between rival factions of the visitors, and he assigned it a precise year, 2024 BCE. The End of Days. Published in 2007, he predicted their return, possibly as soon as 2012, time to the end of the Mesoamerican long count calendar. The reach of all this is difficult to overstate. Beyond. The 12th Planet. He wrote 7 further books in the Earth Chronicles series, and 6 companion volumes besides. Among them, The Stairway to Heaven and The Wars of Gods and Men. His books have sold millions of copies and been translated into more than 25 languages. For an enormous number of readers, This is what the word Anunnaki means, and the tablets themselves have never had a comparable audience. So the scholars answered, and the answer, from the people who read the language for a living, has been unanimous, in a way that scholarly answers rarely are. Sitchin's writings have been universally rejected by mainstream historians, who have labeled his books pseudo-archaeology. Sumerologists, Orientalists, Assyriologists and anthropologists have dismissed the work as pseudoscience and pseudo-history. The criticism gathers into three areas, and each is worth hearing slowly, because each concerns a different kind of care. The first is translation. Ronald Fritzer, a professor and the author of A Study of Invented Knowledge, describes what happens when critics go back to Sitchin's references and check them. They find quotations taken out of context, quotations truncated in ways that distort the evidence presented selectively, and contradictory evidence simply passed over. Fritz's judgment on the vocabulary is blunt. The assignment of meanings to ancient words, he writes, is tendentious and frequently strained. His example is the Sumerian sign Digir, the sign that marks a divine name, which Sitchin rendered as pure ones of the blazing rockets. It does not mean that. It never meant that. It is the ordinary determinative that a scribe placed before a god's name the way we place a capital letter, and the reading is an invention. Michael Heiser, an American biblical scholar, has gone through the translations line by line and found many inaccuracies. He is careful, incidentally, to describe Sitchin's influence honestly, calling him arguably the most important proponent of the ancient astronaut hypothesis over the last several decades, which is a statement about reach, not about truth. And Heiser's response was not merely to assert, it was to invite. He challenges anyone interested to check the readings for themselves against the Sumerian Lexicon, published in 2006. That date matters more than it looks. When Sitchin was writing, only specialists could read Sumerian, which meant that in practice, no ordinary reader could test him. Reference works of that kind changed the situation. The language became checkable by people outside the field, and once a claim can be checked, it stops being a matter of trusting the man who made it. The second area is astronomy, and it fails on the plainest possible grounds. Hundreds of Sumerian astronomical seals and calendars have been decoded and recorded. The number of planets counted on them is 5, not 12, 5. The ones visible to a patient eye from a flat river plain without any instrument at all. And Marduk's planet, in Babylonian cosmology, was Jupiter, bright, known, catalogued, not hidden beyond Neptune on a 3,000-year swing. The third area is the reading of myth as literal report, and it comes to a point on one small object. Cylinder seal VA243 was the centerpiece of the case, a seal bearing a starred symbol with 12 dots around it, which Sitchin identified as a diagram of the solar system, our own plus the extra world. But the seal has writing on it, and the writing has been translated. It reads, in effect, "You're his servant. It appears to be a message from a nobleman to a servant, a personal mark of the kind that thousands of Mesopotamians pressed into wet clay to sign for goods. As for the diagram, Heiser points out that the central symbol is not the Sumerian sign for the sun at all. It bears no resemblance to the hundreds of documented Sumerian sun symbols. It is a star, and the dots around it are stars as well. A little constellation and a note about employment, asked to carry the weight of an entire alternative history of the human species. What followed the refutation has its own quiet momentum, and the mind can receive it loosely, without effort, the way a room absorbs a sound from far away. What happened after the refutation is its own quiet study in how ideas travel, because ideas do not stop when they are corrected. In the 1990s, the British conspiracy theorist David Icke, the man who popularized the reptilian conspiracy theory, began claiming across several books that his reptilian overlords were in fact the Anunnaki. He was clearly influenced by Sitchin and adapted him in favor of his own New Age and conspiratorial agenda. And Icke's version carries something that has to be named plainly rather than described politely. It incorporates far-right claims of an Aryan master race descended by blood from the Anunnaki. That is racist falsehood. It is not a variant reading of Sumerian literature. It is old bigotry, wearing a borrowed cuneiform costume, and it deserves refusal rather than neutral summary. The rest of his construction, dragons, Dracula, draconian law, gathered together as though they were one thing, rests on nothing but the accidental sound of the words. The three unrelated items filed together because they rhyme. The wider drift is gentler and mostly just curious. Some writers see the influence of Sitchin and von Daniken behind the beliefs of the religious sect of Raelism. The writer Mark Pilkington traces the mythology of the Japanese group Panawave back to the 12th planet and its sequels. Corey Kilgannon, reporting for the New York Times, noted that despite the academic dismissal, Sitchin retained a devoted following of readers, and he did. A late-night radio program, on which he was a frequent guest, presented him with a Lifetime Achievement Award in 2010. In 2016, the Iraqi Minister of Transport, Kazem Finjan, told a press conference that the Sumerians had built an airport in the Dekar Governorate and launched spaceships from it 5,000 years ago, citing Sitchin and others by name. Dekar is real ground. It holds some of the oldest cities on Earth. The claim made about it was not. And there is one figure who moved the other way, which is the rarer story and the more human one. Alan Alford, who wrote Gods of the New Millennium, admits that he became, in his own word, infatuated with Sitchin's hypotheses, and then, having gone further into the material, became a critic of Sitchin's interpretations of myth. He changed his mind in public. Not many do. So what remains when the spacecraft are cleared away and the seal is read as the note it is? Something quieter than a face and stranger than a species. The Anunnaki survive not as a portrait, but as a procedure. They are gods who decided together, who sat and heard and settled the fates as a body in an assembly that the Sumerians imagined in the image of their own councils of elders, their own city halls, their own habit of arriving at a decision by agreement rather than by decree. The shape of the idea is what endures, that fate is handed down by a deliberation rather than by a single will, that no complete list of names was ever needed, because the role was never the point, that a tradition can leave its own numbers unsettled, 7 here, 50 there, hundreds elsewhere, and carry the contradiction for 3,000 years without ever feeling the need to resolve it. Even the word itself was never truly a name. It is a grammatical form doing the work of one. The individuals keep their outlines. An of the heavens and Ki of the earth. Enlil, oldest of them. Enki, who could always find another way through. Inanna, who went down and came back. Ereshkigal, who did not need to go anywhere at all. But the collective keeps no face, and after everything the diggers and the grammarians recovered, that absence turns out to be the truest portrait we have of it, a body of deciders, remembered by their deciding. Now let the whole of it settle away from you. Imagine the assembly hall of the old gods far behind you, its weight of judgment and decree no longer pressing on your thoughts. In your mind, reach back and close an invisible door upon that hall of thrones, feeling it move on silent hinges, sealing the fates and the councils in calm and order. Then see one small flame, steady in the darkness before you. With a slow, gentle breath, let that flame go out, and let the last curl of light fade into the night. Rest well, sleep deeply, and let the ancient stories carry you into the night.